Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for being here today. It takes unimaginable courage to stand up to everybody you know and everything you've ever believed in. It takes unquestionable strength to walk into a parliament who defines itself by denying your right to exist. But that's what Dr. Yousef Jabareen and Miko Peled did and do. And as a Palestinian, I only have admiration and awe for their fight for the cause. My name is Shirine Dajani, and I am the daughter of Palestinian refugees who were born in camps in Lebanon and Syria. My identity as a Palestinian was forged by my grandparents' and parents' stories and memories. I listened as they told me how they lost everything and had to start again from nothing. How they fought to survive in foreign lands, far away from their fields and their homes. I grew up angry at what the Israelis did to my country and my family, and angry at many in the Palestinian leadership who stood by and watched. It took me a long time to turn my anger into something more productive. It took people like Dr. Jabareen and Miko Peled who fight alongside each other for what's right. Anger can only get you so far, but what can get us even further is coming together. Miko Peled is a Jewish Israeli whose father was a general in the Israeli army. He grew up in a Zionist home, and he stood up, like his father, to his entire community to fight for what he believes was right. Dr. Yousef Jabareen is a Palestinian-Israeli human rights lawyer who was elected in 2015 to the Israeli parliament, or Knesset, in the Joint Arab List. He represents Palestinians in a government who defines their country as a Jewish nation, where Arabs are second or even third-class citizens. Dr. Jabareen and Miko Peled are considered traitors by many of their own peoples. This is what courage looks like. I couldn't be more honored to have them with us today. So please join me in welcoming them. Thank you very much for being here. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to hear your presentation. Dr. Miko Peled.
Thank you, Shirine, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here again in Bern. It's a great honor to be on the stage with Dr. Jabareen. I think the work that he does and the courage that he displays, working inside the lion's den, working inside the Knesset with probably some of the worst racists, some of the worst haters that you can possibly imagine, and to try to make some kind of, to bring about something positive, at least for his own people, is a very courageous thing. And so he has all my admiration and my respect. And thank you all for being here. I think that the work of the international community, the Palestine solidarity community here in Europe is extremely important. I think it's incumbent upon us to do more, to work harder, because Palestinians are being slaughtered every single day, even as we sit here, denied water, denied electricity, denied life. And so it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to do more, and I appreciate all of you being here today to listen to us. I'm going to begin with a little story. I wonder if all of you know who Ghassan Kanafani is. Ghassan Kanafani was a prolific Palestinian writer and political figure, and he was very brutally assassinated by Israel in 1972 in Beirut. Incidentally, I was at Tel Aviv airport just a couple of weeks ago, and in my luggage they saw a poster that I had with Ghassan Kanafani, and they pulled me out to ask me about this. He's been dead for more than 40 years and they're still afraid of him. But he was a writer. And the reason I bring him up is as follows. There's an interview with him in English that came up maybe 6 months ago on the internet. And what's very refreshing and inspiring about this interview is his clarity. The interviewer, who's Australian, tries to impose upon him this narrative, a certain narrative. And Ghassan Kanafani stands up and will not accept the narrative, will not accept the premise. And it's very refreshing because I think oftentimes people are afraid when we talk about Palestine, people are intimidated or afraid to be very clear. So he makes it very clear. He says, I'm sorry? People are afraid to be clear. And so he makes it very clear that the struggle of the Palestinian people is a struggle of a nation that has been dispossessed. It's a struggle of a nation for its liberty. It's a struggle of a nation for its human rights and so forth. And then he goes on to say a few more things. He says, for example, he talks about the Palestinian struggle. And he says, we, the Palestinians, prefer to die standing. We're going to fight till the last drop of blood to achieve justice. For us to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, and our human rights is as essential as life itself. Palestinians are being killed whether they die, whether they're standing or they're laying down and sleeping in their beds. We've seen this over and over the last 7 decades. Now, if a white man says this, if an American says this, if an Israeli says this, then we call them heroes because they're fighting for justice, they're fighting for freedom. If a Palestinian says this, he's a terrorist. If a Palestinian talks about his right to fight for his people, to fight for justice, then immediately he's a terrorist and he has to be killed. And of course, that's what happened to Ghassan Kanafani and many, many thousands of other Palestinians. So this double standard is quite obvious, but the clarity of his words I thought was inspiring. Now, when people talk about Palestine, they call it a conflict, they call it a dispute, they call it an occupation. And it always seems like people are shooting but missing the target on purpose. Shooting and missing the target on purpose. And what I would like to propose, particularly here standing in Switzerland, is that over the last 69 years, there has been a genocide going on. There has been genocide to which the Palestinians have been the subject. And Israel has been the perpetrator. Now, it's very easy to find out what genocide is because we have the Geneva Convention. And if you read the Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, it describes the crime of genocide. And if we compare that to what Israel has been doing for the last 69 years, or what has been taking place in Palestine over the 69 years, it is almost identical. It's not identical, but it's very close to being identical. One of the important parts of this document is that it talks about intent. In other words, it's not just the destruction of a people. It's not just the destruction of a racial or ethnic group, but it's the intent. And when we look at the history of Palestine over the last 69 years, I don't think there can be any doubt that massacre after massacre, destruction after destruction, town after town being destroyed, there cannot be any doubt that this was done intentionally. That the destruction of the Palestinian people, whether in Gaza, whether during 1948, during the ethnic cleansing, whether in Jerusalem, whether on a daily basis, young Palestinians being killed, whether it's denying people water, that there's a policy here that is intentional. And again, drawing inspiration from Ghassan Kanafani's clarity, I would invite all of you to examine this. and not be afraid to call the reality in Palestine what it truly is. It is genocide. There's also ethnic cleansing. And there's also a regime of apartheid that has been in place for the last 69 years. But people always say to me, you know, why do you have to say these words? It's so offensive. It's so harsh. And my reply is, the word is offensive? The definition is what's offensive? The fact that 2 million people in Gaza have no water, that does not offend you? The fact that Israel on a regular basis murders thousands of civilians in Gaza, that does not offend you? The ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 does not offend you? The racist laws do not offend you? It's the name that offends you? Unless we say what it really is, we will never be able to fix it. Can you imagine in South Africa, people would have said, you know, don't call it apartheid. It's not a very nice name. Of course, in South Africa, they named it apartheid. The Israelis, the Zionists, were smarter. They gave it a kinder name. They call it Israel. But that's what Israel represents. It's a genocide. It's an ethnic cleansing. And it's an apartheid regime. Now, it's interesting because people talk about Palestine. One of the ways in which people describe Palestine, they say there's Israel proper, and then there's the occupied Palestinian territories. Well, my question is, what does Israel proper mean? And are there Palestinian territories somewhere that are not occupied? If you say the occupied Palestinian territories, it almost sounds like there are some Palestinian territories somewhere that are not occupied. In 1948, when supposedly the State of Israel was established, 1948 was the occupation of the majority of Palestine took place. That's when the majority of Palestine was occupied. But suddenly people choose to forget that, and they say, well, we're going to forget that. We're only going to focus on a small part of Palestine that Israel chose to occupy in 1967. But what actually happened in 1967? It wasn't the beginning of an occupation. We're now 50 years since that occupation, and people talk about commemorating 50 years of the occupation. It's 50 years of the completion of the occupation. The taking of the West Bank and Gaza was not the beginning of an occupation, it was the completion. They finished the job. And the generals, the Israeli generals, who were commanders at that time, my father was one of them, they called it finishing the job. Finishing the job that wasn't finished in 1948. And by doing so, when we recognize this, we can sweep away the whole ridiculous argument of a two-state solution. Because when Israel took the West Bank, it finalized establishing a single state in Palestine, all of Palestine, with exclusive rights for Jewish people. And that state is the State of Israel. So any notion that somehow there could be an Israeli government that would give it back, would allow the Palestinians a state, is complete science fiction. Within hours of taking the West Bank, Israel did in the West Bank what they did in 1948. Destroyed Palestinian towns, sent hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into exile, and began massive building for Jews, which is the whole purpose of taking the West Bank. It wasn't a mistake. The plan to take the West Bank, the plan to complete the conquest of the land of Israel was in place a very long time before that. The opportunity came up in 1967, and by doing this, of course, they thought they erased Palestine. And if you look at Israeli maps, in school books, in geography books, if you look at weather maps, there's no such thing as a West Bank. There's Judea and Samaria. And Judea and Samaria, like the Galilee, like the Negev, these are all parts of the State of Israel. There's even a Judea and Samaria district of the Israeli police force. And they have a pin that they wear with their logo. And the pin is the shape of the West Bank. And inside it says, Shomron Yehuda, Judea, Samaria. And they serve hundreds of thousands of Jewish citizens. Never mind that within that area there are about 3 million Palestinians, but that's not our problem as Israelis. They do not really exist. So I think it's important to come to terms with how the progression of the occupation came about and what the purpose of it was, what the intent of it was. The intent was to take all of Palestine, turn it into Israel, and somehow either get rid of or ignore the fact that there are Palestinians. And that's exactly what it was. Now I think it's important to talk about the Gaza Strip. People talk about the Gaza Strip as though it is some kind of a natural creation, a natural entity. There's nothing natural about the Gaza Strip. It was a line that was drawn, determined by Israel in the early 1950s, and it was a place to push into hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. And today we know there are 2 million people living there with no access to clean water, irregular electric supply, no access to proper medicine, no access to proper nutrition, and on a regular basis, massive attacks, massive massacres that people like to call a war for reasons that I find puzzling. Because they're not a war, they are a massacre. They're not some kind of an offensive, a military offensive. They are a massacre intending to murder as many civilians as possible. And what's interesting about the Israeli attacks, they began very early on. And people look at the Gaza Strip and they say sometimes, why are there so many people there? Why is there such poverty there? Why is there such unemployment there? Nobody says, look at the education levels, how high they are. But none of this, why are they shooting rockets at us? Why is there Hamas? None of this would have happened had it not been for the initial crime of the ethnic cleansing of 1948. If we don't connect the reality in Gaza today to what happened 69, 70 years ago, of course nothing makes sense. If we refuse to look at what happened 69 years ago, nothing makes sense. We have to take a look and see the connection. There would be no refugees, there would be no resistance, there would be no poverty unless it was imposed on them by the brutality of this new creation of the State of Israel. And they began attacking the Gaza Strip as soon as they established the Gaza Strip. It was in the early 1950s that the Gaza Strip was finalized, and it was in the early 1950s that Israel began going in and committing massacres. There was a special military unit that was commanded by Ariel Sharon, the famous butcher who later on became prime minister. He's in one of these pictures. And this is this commando coming out of Gaza victorious after destroying terrorists. Who are these terrorists? These were poor refugees who would try to go back to their homes sometimes, and they called them infiltrators. So then they would go in and they would commit a terrible massacre as punitive operations. Later on, they stopped calling them infiltrators, they called them fedayeen, then they called them terrorists, today they call them Hamas. And of course, when they attack them today, it looks like this, modern weapons. So whereas in the 1950s, they killed dozens, maybe hundreds, in 2014, they murdered 2,500 people in broad daylight in 51 days. Never mind the countless that died later on from their injuries because Israel would not give them access to health care. And the hundreds of thousands of homeless and so forth. And this, of course, is the result. Destruction. This is Gaza. But of course, this reality doesn't only exist in Gaza. This is Jerusalem. Homes demolished. Homes and homes and homes, beautiful homes demolished. I took these pictures just recently, and you look at these homes and you say, why were they destroyed? Well, because they had no permit. Many people build without a permit, but when Jews build without a permit, nothing happens. You don't see the army come. You don't see bulldozers destroying. It's very hard to get a permit. To build, to add a room for your children, to close maybe a balcony. People do it, they get the permit later. But when Palestinians do it, the army shows up and destroys their homes. This is exclusive. Look at this, entire neighborhoods, entire cities, towns around Jerusalem that have become ghost towns. completely ghost towns. These were major thoroughfares, major business centers, dead, not a soul in sight. Beautiful apartment buildings, beautiful shops, dead because of the wall, because of bypass roads and so forth, and because of a policy of extermination and ethnic cleansing. When you look at these things, when I saw these things, the only word that I could think of was Holocaust. That was the only thing I could think of. This is Hebron, Shuhada Street in Hebron, dead. Used to be a major business center in the old city of Hebron, dead. And the question that people never ask for some reason is why? Why is Israel killing people in Gaza? Why is Israel destroying Palestinian towns in Jerusalem? Why is Israel imposing these catastrophic policies on a nation that has never had a military? Everybody who knows anything about this issue knows that Palestinians never posed a military threat to Israel, never posed an existential threat to Israel because they have never had a military. Israel bombs Gaza, dropping millions of tons of bombs on a civilian population. But why? There has never been a military threat from Gaza. So why are they killing so many people? Why are they doing it on a regular basis for almost 7 decades? Because if there is no military threat, what is their problem? And I would argue that the problem is not a military threat. The reality, the humanitarian disaster that exists today in the Gaza Strip, the existence of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and of course in other parts of the country too, is a major threat, not to the security of the State of Israel, but to the legitimacy of the State of Israel. When you see people living as second and third class citizens, living under racist laws, when you see, like I said, the humanitarian catastrophe that is Gaza. And by the way, the UN keeps coming out with all these reports, and all these NGOs and human rights groups come out with reports saying that Gaza is going to be a humanitarian disaster. Going to be? It's been a humanitarian disaster for 7 decades. Going to be? Have they visited Gaza? Have they tried to live there? The existence of this reality points to the illegitimacy of the State of Israel, and that is why they must die. Because there are only 2 options. Leaving things the way they are is impossible. So you either fix the problem, for example, allow the refugees to return to their homes, spend all the money that you need to rebuild Gaza, if we're talking about the Gaza Strip. But we don't want the Arabs back. That's why there's a Gaza Strip, because they were kicked out. So the other option is to murder them and tell the world that it's their fault because they're terrorists. And by some stroke of magic, it works. 2 million people, defenseless, that never had a military force, are being murdered by Israel, whether it's through bombs or through denying them water and medicine. Israel claims that it's self-defense because they're terrorists, and the entire world shakes their hands like dummies and saying, yes, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. Defend itself against what? When are people going to stand up and tell Israel that it is enough to lie, that we will not accept their lies anymore, we will not accept their murderous policies anymore? But the world shakes their head and said, yes, defense, self-defense, self-defense, and keep selling them weapons, keep selling them weapons. Like drug dealers, keeping the drug flow going. Which is, of course, if we look at the Geneva Convention, it is also a crime to be complicit in genocide. And that is the West, that is the EU, that is Europe, that is the United States. Complicit in this crime of genocide. Now, if there's one thing that Palestinians are not allowed to be associated with, it's resistance. They can be victims, they can be terrorists. But resistance means that maybe there's some legitimacy to their fight. Resistance sounds heroic. So when young Palestinians in Gaza try to fight that enormous behemoth of the Israeli military, they call them terrorists. Although if they were any other nation, they would be called heroes. But Palestinians are not allowed to be heroes. So hundreds of young Palestinians who were killed trying to fight in small battles within Gaza, of course, are forgotten. But we have to remember that that was a legitimate resistance, and they are heroes. But we can't talk about Palestinians in those kinds of terms. Now, when people talk about resistance, quite often they think, oh, you're talking about terrorism, you're talking about armed resistance, which, as we know, historically, armed resistance has had its role in the fight against colonialism and the fight of people for their liberation. But it doesn't always have to be the case. We know today, as a result of the experience in India, the result of the experience of blacks in America, of course, as a result of the South African experience, that resistance does not always have to involve violence, does not always have to be armed. We know that we can impose economic pressure. We know that there's isolation. We know that South Africa was not allowed to participate in the Olympics. They were not allowed to play rugby with other countries and so forth. And we know, and we should respect, and we should take part in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. People hear BDS and they suddenly become afraid. They suddenly become worried about being called, anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. But it's important to take a look at the BDS movement. The call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions was a gift to all of us from Palestine. It was a gift by Palestinian civil society to the rest of the world, to people of conscience, giving us not only a roadmap, but very clear guidelines and very clear demands. Israel divided Palestinians into refugees, the Palestinians who are so-called Israeli citizens, and the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. The BDS demands deal with all three. And what are these demands that people are so afraid of? Ending the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and getting rid of the wall, recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens inside of Israel to equal rights, and respecting international law and allowing the refugees to return, the right of return. The three most reasonable demands you can imagine. All of them remedial. All of these are remedial demands. In other words, trying to remedy a condition that exists today. Nothing in the demands of the BDS says anything against the Jews. Nothing is targeting the Jews that live in Palestine. Nothing here is against Israel. It's all to remedy the conditions under which the Palestinians live. To take this and equate this with terrorism, to take this and equate it with anti-Semitism, is nonsense of the worst kind. It's absolute nonsense to equate BDS with terrorism or anti-Semitism. It is remedial, and it says nothing about hurting anyone. It's only trying to remedy conditions that were imposed on the Palestinians by Israel. Completely reasonable, completely dedicated, and by the way, very effective. If anybody has any doubts that the BDS movement has been effective, then there's a lot of information that we can take a look at and see that it's been very, very effective. And of course, Israel's panic, I should say, as a result of the BDS movement is a testament to that. Now, there's something very interesting that has been taking place in the United States, around the world, and in Palestine itself, which is equating charity to Palestinians with terrorism. It takes a sick mind of a special kind to equate charity with terrorism. But Israel cannot allow any legitimization of any Palestinian demands, including the demand or the striving for charity. So there was a case in the United States that was kind of the main pillar, the main case, which was called the case of the Holy Land Foundation. And what they said was the Holy Land Foundation, this was a Muslim charity. They were supporting orphans, and they were supporting the families of prisoners. And they made all of that criminal. And you have to think, what kind of a sick mind can take charity and make it criminal? How could it possibly work? Well, there are enough sick minds to put it together. Now, I'm going to show you pictures of 5 men. 5 Palestinians in the United States are in federal prison now for many, many years. These are men that were associated with the Holy Land Foundation. And the reason I investigated this is because it's the subject of a book that I'm about to publish. But this equation, look at the sentences, look at the long sentences they received. The bottom 2, 65 years. I visited these men in federal prison, all but one actually, in the United States. And what they said is this. They showed that the Holy Land Foundation supported the orphans. And they had a list of orphans and the cause of death of the father. And the cause of death, in many cases, it says martyr, which is really a term of respect for somebody who died. What the prosecution, which was the state of the U.S. government, in collusion with the state of Israel, using Israeli experts as witnesses, said, these are all suicide bombers. When you support the children of these people, you're encouraging suicide bombers. Well, 2 things they left out. Number 1, none of the men on those lists were ever involved in any kind of terrorism or any kind of any kind of military or armed struggle. Number 2, none of the suicide bombers that were active when they were in Palestine had children. So none of these orphans were connected to anybody who did anything that has to do with suicide bombing or terrorism or anything like that. But who wants to confuse the facts with a good story? And then they said, and this is happening now in Palestine too, they just closed the Palestinian National Fund, part of which supports the families of prisoners. Now we know Israel has been holding thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. So they say, well, if you support their families, you're supporting terrorism. Now check Israeli sources, you'll find out that most of the Palestinians in Israeli jails have never been charged with violence, most of them. In other words, these are all political prisoners. But even supporting their families, even paying the lawyers who defend them is now associated with terrorism. This is just how far this anti-Palestinian sentiment has gone. Not even charity to Palestinians can be legitimate. And again, it's one of those issues that we have to get our heads around and fight this. Which again, like I said, this is a copy, this is my book, this is the book that's coming out. Like I said, it's going to come out in the fall. It's called Injustice, and it's that story. Because it's a story that nobody talks about. These men are in jail and nobody hears about it. These are kind of sideline stories, but that have to be told because this is a reality. This is a reality of an entire nation where now they can't even get charity. Never mind they don't get support from the rest of the world. I think that, like I said earlier, those of us who sit here and in rooms like this around the world, we can talk about the issues of Palestine, we can talk about the suffering of Palestinians, and we should. But more importantly, it is incumbent upon all of us who are rich and free and alive at the same time, to find hope and then act. We do not have the luxury to say it is hopeless. We do not have the luxury to say it's too complicated. We do not have the luxury to say, well, it's too bad. We do not have that luxury. We must find hope and we must act. And there are only 2 options. It's not that difficult. The reality in Palestine offers us 2 options. The first one is to accept Israel. Accepting Israel means accepting an occupied Palestine and a state that offers exclusive rights for people like myself, Jewish people. It means thousands of political prisoners, it means massacres in Gaza, it means denying Palestinians water. This is the reality. This is how Israel has always been. And that's one option, to accept the state of Israel in Palestine, a state that offers exclusive rights for Jewish people in an Arab land. We can accept that. That's one option. There is no other Israel, by the way. Some people think that there's this idea of a liberal, friendly kind of an Israel that will make peace with the Palestinians. There's no evidence to that. There's never been any evidence to that. That has never existed. And I think we can safely say will never exist. So that's one option. The other option, however, is a free Palestine, a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, that respects human rights and respects the rights of refugees to return and respects the right of political movements to fight for justice and so on. That option exists too. And I would argue, or actually I would invite you to decide which of these two options offers hope. Which of these two options offers us hope for the future, for Palestinians as well as Israelis? And I would argue that the second option is the one that offers hope, and I would encourage all of you to stand behind that option and to realize that in order to get to that option, BDS is the tool, and BDS is the gift that we were given in order to get to that point. Because no privileged people ever give up their privilege willingly. And I want to close with this image. This is an image that we took in a refugee camp, in a Palestinian refugee camp, which is so horrifying, so horrible, so tragic, the life in that camp, that none of us would be smiling. In fact, those of us that did visit, we couldn't stop our tears. The reality is so harsh. And look at these children. Now, why are these beautiful smiling faces forced to live in an environment without clean water, without sewage, without proper health care, constantly being bombarded? Why do they have to live this? Because Israel denies them the right to return. Israel has banned Palestinians from returning to their homes. So these children, who are probably the grandchildren of the original refugees, are forced to live like this. And this is no more than half an hour, maybe an hour from their original homes. But they are banned from returning because they're Palestinians, because Israel said so. And I invite all of you to think about the term Free Palestine. I have it right here, also on my thing. What does it mean when we say Free Palestine? Does it mean a third of Palestine? Does it mean a little bit of Palestine here and a little bit of Palestine there? No. Palestine is an entire country. Free Palestine means from the river to the sea. It means Al-Jalil, it means Al-Nakab, it means Jerusalem, it means Haifa and Jaffa. A free Palestine must be a free Palestine, all of it, with no checkpoints, and with no racist laws, and with equality, and equal access to water, and equal access to travel. And if we do our job, all of us, and if we act correctly, then Palestine absolutely can be free, and will be free, and much sooner than most people think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peled. We'll now take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back with Dr. Yousef Jabareen. Thank you.